In my recent video that's titled The Real Reason Why CRT Monitors Are Better, I said I would do a follow-up showing people how to actually get a CRT to work on a modern PC. But I feel the need to also explain how one can acquire a CRT monitor for those that haven't already, and there's a reason for that. Thanks to certain videos on YouTube, some people may be led to believe that getting back into CRTs can be difficult and an expensive endeavor. Well, like with PC gaming in general, it can get very expensive the more high-end the product is. But common CRT models from the 2000s, like the 17-inch Dell and Samsung SyncMaster I use today, offer quality that is acceptably close enough to something like the now highly coveted ViewSonic E series. And I can say that with some authority because I also own an E series. Well, not anymore. I don't want to talk about it. But in a way, I actually prefer these two monitors. They come in black, which looks way better than the beige set when sitting next to a modern LCD. They also aren't as bulky as the ViewSonic, both in the rear and the front, with slightly thinner bezels, and still at a very affordable price, even now, but not everyone believes this. In my last video, there was a comment that mentioned that CRTs are no longer affordable. I mean, yeah, if you take the lazy route and just go on eBay and search CRT monitor, but guys, there used to be as many CRT monitors in practically every household as there are dishwashers. Just get up off your lazy butt and put in a little more effort, go down to a pawn shop, visit a garage sale, e-waste facilities, or stop by your grandma's and inquire of whatever happened to that PC she used to have 15 years ago. Odds are she still has it in the attic or something. There has to be a CRT somewhere in your town that is in decent working condition that doesn't cost an arm and a leg. Unless you live in the middle of nowhere or a snobby wealthy town with citizens that would hurl at the mere sight of a 90s Ford Focus, which I guess if you lived in a posh place like that, then price probably isn't really an issue. But as for the rest of us, yes, CRTs will become harder to find for a decent price in the years to come. But at the time of this recording, it's actually usually the collectible monitors like the ViewSonics and the Trinitrons that can cost a lot. But a basic Samsung, Dell or LG, it's not too late. There is always an unwanted CRT somewhere nearby that people want to get rid of, but haven't gotten around to doing it for whatever reason. I mean, throwing away CRTs are actually a bit harder than just chucking them in a nearby dumpster. And yeah, some people do just do that, but they shouldn't. That's e-waste. That's really bad. So my Samsung SyncMaster, which is not yet a premium display in the retro gaming market, cost me about $40. Granted, this was maybe 2 years ago or something like that. My Dell, which is only slightly less capable to the SyncMaster, came to $0 because I got it from an aunt that was relieved, but also confused when I asked her if I could have it. And I get why she didn't understand why I was so giddy as I carried what was to her this big paperweight to my car. CRTs can be invasive in their very nature, especially when space is limited. But they don't have to be, and that's because they do not replace a modern display, especially for productivity use cases. This is why I recommend that you have a setup that utilizes both a modern display and a CRT. CRTs are better than modern displays at one thing only, and that is gaming. This means the display doesn't need to be as big, since you don't need to have as much screen real estate for showing dense small text in websites or spreadsheets or clusters of multitasking apps. But for just video games, a 17-inch is perfectly fine. However, if you feel you can afford to use something bigger, like 19 inches or more, then go for it. But a 17-inch CRT is sometimes all people can deal with. But still, the strength of CRTs still remains, even in these more restrictive scenarios. Okay, let's stop wasting time. Getting a CRT to run on a PC that has a graphics card older than a decade or so was really easy, since a lot of them had analog capable ports. Either they used VGA, which is usually the only connector a CRT monitor has, or DVI, so you'll need to get your hands on a DVI to VGA converter, but since the DVI's analog signal is the same as a VGA, this adapter is usually small, simple and cheap, without compromising on image quality since no signal conversion is taking place. But be careful, make sure your graphics card's DVI port has the right pins for an analog signal, since DVI can sometimes only do digital. And this is the issue with modern graphics cards, which don't have any capability of sending out an analog signal even if it has a DVI port. So we'll need a sort of digital to analog converter, or DAC of some kind. Now, fortunately, VGA is a standard that doesn't seem to want to die because of how common it is, and I have some good news. Unlike an episode of My Life in Gaming or Retro RGB, converting a digital signal from something like an HDMI to VGA is very inexpensive. A simple HDMI to VGA dongle is all you need. In fact, I have 3 different variants. All 3 of them work the same. Now, if you're like me that uses a graphics card that only has one HDMI port, and let's say your main LCD or OLED display is plugged into that HDMI port, that usually is not a problem. You can get a DisplayPort to HDMI converter for either your main display or for your CRT, and don't worry about having 2 video conversion adapters between your PC and your CRT monitor. It won't add any additional lag or compatibility issues, since no real processing is taking place in this adapter because of just how sophisticated DisplayPort is, which is able to detect and adapt to the HDMI protocol. And as far as I know, all modern cards can do that. So you'll only need an inexpensive passive DisplayPort to HDMI converter like a dongle, or even just a plain old DisplayPort to HDMI cable, which I personally don't need since I'm using a monitor that does connect through a DisplayPort. But for those that don't, there's that option. And that is pretty much it. Well, actually only in terms of hardware. There is stuff we'll need to do in software to get the most out of your CRT. So once you have everything plugged in, Windows should be able to detect the CRT. If not automatically, then you'll need to manually switch from your modern display to the CRT by bringing up the project menu by holding down the Windows and P key, and just cycle through 4 separate options by either using your mouse or by just hitting the P key whilst still holding down the Windows key. This is great if for some reason the CRT has a black screen and doesn't show anything. So just by tapping the key, you can then switch back to your main display without needing to blindly navigate through the project menu with a mouse. A quick side note, the project menu usually gives each monitor one of 2 labels: first screen, which is strangely referred to in the menu as PC screen, or second screen. Now, I get that project menu is designed for people that are using literal projectors that are plugged into their PC so they can tell the difference, but it works the same with dual monitor setup, so it can be a bit confusing. Now, which of your 2 monitors will be assigned first screen depends on which port it's plugged into. So sometimes, depending on how your graphics card handles the port hierarchy, the CRT can become first screen with your main display set to second. This isn't a big deal, but if you don't like the arrangement, then you'll have to swap some cables around. And yes, you can change this in your video card settings, but that only affects Windows. The boot up sequence, your motherboard's BIOS settings menu, and sometimes the Windows login screen will always be displayed on the first screen. Okay, so even though I'm using an Nvidia card, all you AMD card users out there should be able to do all these exact same things in theory. But since I'm a filthy Nvidia shill, some of this stuff might not apply to you. But really, AMD is capable of all of the same stuff I will be mentioning from this point on. Now, if you're an Intel graphics user, there's no guarantee this will work, even though it might, because really most of the stuff is handled by Windows and not entirely your graphics driver. Except there is one thing that I think applies only to Nvidia cards, and that is Windows sometimes doesn't detect the CRT for whatever random reason, and it turns out this is actually a firmware bug that applies to pretty much all Nvidia cards prior to the 20 or 30 series. So for those users, you'll need to download the Nvidia graphics firmware update tool for DisplayPort 1.3 and 1.4. Link in the description below. This is not a driver update, it is a firmware update, so I would recommend that you have your PC plugged into a UPS, because if the installation is interrupted, it could very likely brick your graphics card. So Why is this firmware important, especially since we don't even need DisplayPort 1.3 or 1.4 in this situation? Well, it turns out that this fix for the bug that affected the DisplayPort's monitor detection capability improves the detection capability across the board, including the card's ability to properly detect the CRT, even if it's plugged into HDMI and not just DisplayPort. Okay, with all that annoyance out the way, even though this next bit may seem to be very technical, just follow my instructions and you'll be just fine. Usually at this point, Windows will be able to detect the CRT no problem. The technology is so old, however, that a lot of the time Windows doesn't know the CRT's full capabilities. So often you will only have access to a handful of resolutions and refresh rates to choose from. And a lot of them may not be very comfortable to look at if the refresh rate isn't higher than 60 Hz, which gives the appearance of the screen flashing at you. If you haven't seen my previous video on CRTs, check it out because it will explain why even though 60 Hz on the CRT TV doesn't have any noticeable flicker, a computer monitor set to 60 is noticeable. I'm not going to get into it now of why that is, just watch that video if you're curious. But needless to say, we really should be aiming for at least 70 Hz. That is the point where the flicker stops being noticeable by a human eye. So every time a new monitor is installed, Windows will request some information from the monitor, like the name of the model, what its capabilities are, its native resolution, and other stuff like that. This information is then stored in the Windows registry, but often Windows will struggle with this and may not be able to gather enough information about the CRT beyond maybe the model name, but sometimes not even that. So we'll need to manually tell the Windows registry what the CRT's model ID is, along with all the info it needs. Now, don't worry, we're not going to be messing around with registries and stuff like that. There's already a tool that can do all that for us. Go and download Custom Resolution Utility, or CRU, a tool by ToastyX. I'm currently using version 1.5.1. I'll have the download link in the description below. After downloading, you may need to also unzip the folder, go into it, and you'll notice some executables. Launch the one simply called CRU, but before you do, you really should be running this app on your CRT and not on some other display. So switch to that if you haven't already. The reason is because the utility will need to be able to identify the monitor that you're using, especially if Windows can't even tell what your CRT is even called. Sure, you could check on the back of the monitor itself to see what its model name is, but that can only take us so far because we need to make sure we select the right display. We definitely don't want to accidentally make changes to your modern display, but don't get too worried if you mess something up or make a horrible mistake, because one of those other executables in that folder called reset all will do exactly that by resetting all currently plugged in monitors to their default profiles. Again, this only affects the Windows registry profiles. None of it will mess with the actual monitors themselves. So when you go to the drop-down menu, it shows a list of all the different displays that are stored in your Windows registry, or in other words, every single display that has ever been connected to your PC in the past. So this list can potentially be really long. But all we need to focus on is the one that has the word active in parentheses. This is why we have to do this on the CRT, so that the utility can detect which of these displays is currently in use, especially if you don't know the name of the CRT, in which case it may just refer to it as generic plug-and-play monitor. However, that's the worst case scenario. In most situations, there will at least be some kind of model name. In my case, Windows was able to detect my Dell model ID E772P and my Samsung SyncMaster CRT, which I used a few months prior, but even if you know the name of your monitor, the active label is still important because there may be some duplicates that are basically red herrings. I don't know why they are duplicates. I don't know why they exist. Just ignore anything that isn't labeled active. So once you have selected your CRT, you'll see there's a bunch of resolutions that may or may not be activated. So what? Just enable everything and then click OK? No. What's listed here are really only the more common basic standard stuff and don't necessarily reflect the true capabilities of your CRT. So we need to find out some things about this monitor, and there are two approaches to this. The first is to go to your web browser and do a search of your display's name and model, and chances are you'll find a page that lists the specs and features of your CRT. The second approach, if you can't find any info on what your monitor specs are, then no joke, you can just experiment. Try out a bunch of relatively high standardized resolutions at a somewhat low refresh rate like 70 Hertz. And if the CRT happens to not support that specific resolution, then it just won't work. The CRT will simply display a message like out of range. You won't be able to break your monitor just by trying out a whole bunch of resolution and frequency profiles. I mean, it is more time consuming, but totally doable. However, if you are able to find some technical info about your CRT monitor, there are some key things to note, like what your display's max resolution and refresh rate is. In my case, this Dell I'm using can support 1280 by 1024, with 70 Hz being that resolution's maximum refresh rate. And the absolute highest refresh rate is 120 Hz, with that refresh rate's maximum resolution being 640 by 480. So the rule of thumb is as you lower the maximum refresh rate, you can increase the resolution or vice versa. And these different refresh rates would usually be in intervals of 5 Hz, so like 70, 75, 80, 85, etc., with one exception, and that is 72 Hz, since that is the standard refresh rate for motion pictures, which is intentionally different from the frame rate of movies that are 24 frames a second. Just watch my other video if you don't know why 72 is so important. In fact, my Samsung SyncMaster's max frequency at its max resolution is 72 Hz, and that's not a coincidence. All right, so let's go back to CRU. We now know the max resolution and the max frequency, so you can tick off those two in CRU, but if there isn't an option for one or more of those resolution frequency combinations, then you're going to need to do a custom list. Like how here there is no 120 Hertz listed anywhere, but is capped off at only 75. So go over to the right here under standard resolutions and click on add. Here I'm going to select 640 by 480 since that is the highest resolution that the CRT can handle at its absolute max refresh rate of 120. So after changing it to 120, click OK, and there it is. Now let's do the maximum resolution, which is 1280 by 1024. With 70 Hertz being its highest at that resolution. However, I'm not actually going to be adding this resolution because out of all of these standard resolutions, 1280 by 1024 is not a 4:3 aspect ratio, but is in fact a 5:4. And this, as well as most CRTs, are usually 4:3. So according to the little amount of info I can find on the matter, if a manufacturer wanted their consumer monitor to be fully VESA compliant, it had to support 1280 by 1024 and not just 1280 by 960, which actually is the 4:3 equivalent. But since Windows and many Windows games like to default to the monitor's max resolution, I don't want it to always default to a totally wrong aspect ratio, so I'm just not even going to give Windows the option. On a side note, eventually we would get consumer-grade 1280 by 1024 LCD monitors at the turn of the 21st century because they're great for word processing and also web browsing. So every time someone on eBay is trying to sell you a 4:3 LCD monitor, 95% of the time it's actually a 5:4 monitor. Okay, so we have max refresh rate and max 4:3 resolution that the CRT is capable of producing. Now we can keep adding new combinations of resolutions and refresh rates, in between these two extremes. But for now, let's just click on OK. All right, so it's saved, but we need to execute the changes. By running restart 64, since I'm using the 64-bit version of Windows, the screen will turn to black for a few seconds as the new display profile is applied. You can even hear the disconnect and connect device sound effect, and that should be it. But if you don't see an image, then press F8 to undo the changes, fix whatever error you made, and then try again. Now, some people might point out that many video card drivers have already built-in features for adding custom resolutions. Yeah, except in the case of the Nvidia control panel as an example, if the driver doesn't believe your monitor can handle a certain resolution, when in reality it can, the GPU very often will handle the scaling instead of your monitor. Custom resolutions are never treated as standard resolution, so some applications, including certain games, won't even let you select that custom resolution. They just won't detect it. CRU is just much better in this regard because it is telling your PC that these are resolutions your monitor can natively produce. And so all your games never question it. If they offer that specific resolution, it will work. All right, technically we're done, but one of the most annoying things with certain games is that sometimes a game will pick really random and strange resolution and refresh rate combos like Quake 3 Arena of all games. I mean, Quake 3 Arena is like one of the most stable, most well put together games of all time, but I guess you can't be perfect because often, not always, but often, this game likes to default to 60 Hz. Not a problem for LCDs, big problem for CRTs because of the flicker. However, like with most games, Quake 3 won't run in a particular refresh rate if Windows won't let it. Usually when you pick a resolution in a video game, each option may come with a rather long list of frequencies that can run in said resolution. So for instance, if I picked 800 by 600, it may give me an option to select 60, 70, 72, 75, 85, and 100. But this is the best part about CRU. You don't need to activate or add all these different refresh rates that isn't this resolution's maximum, in this case being 100 Hz. So just add 800 by 600, add 100 Hz, and that's it. Don't add any other frequencies in that same resolution. The result is that every time you select this resolution, the game will be forced to run at that 100 Hz refresh rate. So every time I run 1280 by 960, it's always 70 and never 60. If I select 1024 by 768, it will always be 85 and so on. Now that's for, well, relatively modern stuff, but what about real retro resolutions like 240p or in the case of games for DOS, 200p, specifically 320 by 200, which is technically a 16 by 10 aspect ratio. In fact, older PC games had a lot of 16 by 10 resolutions to choose from. Aha! So that's why back in the day, LCDs were 16 by 10 at first before 16 by 9 replaced it. But anyways, 320 by 200 used to be a very common resolution for DOS gaming because it was a little faster and used slightly less VRAM or processing than the 4x3 equivalent of 320 by 240. Doesn't sound like much, but trust me, back in those days with those really slow 386s and 486s, that did actually boost performance quite a lot. But even though 320 by 200 is technically a widescreen resolution, these games were still designed for 4x3 aspect ratio. Kind of like how the NES and SNES ran games at 256 by 224, which was not 4x3 on paper, but the TV would always stretch the image to make it 4x3, so each pixel isn't perfectly square. They are slightly rectangular, but here's the thing. Unlike retro game consoles, desktop CRTs from the 90s and 2000s never presented these games in their native resolution. This is because high-res capable desktop monitors need to have very thin scan lines to be able to fit like over 1,000 or more progressive lines as opposed to a TV's 480 or 576 at most that are interlaced, so half the work of that even. So these tiny scan lines would actually be way too skinny for something as low as 200p, so you'd mostly be seeing really thick black lines compared to what a similar signal would look on a CRT television. So what most PC monitors would do is double the resolution for these really low video signals. So even though a game like Doom would send a signal of 320 by 200, the monitor would increase that to 640 by 400. And that is a very important number because that is the resolution of DOS before graphics-based OSs like Windows and Linux took over the PC ecosystem. And this might surprise you, but modern displays still by default support this resolution right out the box, since many motherboard boot sequences and system BIOS menus run at 640 by 400. So although a modern graphics card cannot support a very outdated 320 by 200 image, they can still output 640 by 400. So we're going to add that in the standard resolutions list and set it to 70 Hz because that was also the standard for DOS. And fun fact, this is why Doom ran at 35 frames per second. If you know your math, 35 is exactly half of 70. So we're adding this profile because if you run something like Dosbox, you will be able to experience DOS games exactly how they were back in the 90s, since even back then, 200p games will always double to 400p video signal. So I might as well show this now since we're on the topic. The best way to set up Dosbox is to go open the config in the text editor, go to where full resolution is and put there original, then scroll down to the render section and next to scalar input normal 2x and make sure aspect is set to false. The normal 2x setting will make all low-res games run at double resolution, while higher-res stuff, like the DOS prompt, will be displayed in its native resolution of 640 by 400, or any game that happens to also support that resolution. And the reason for full resolution being set to original will allow for other stuff that isn't just 200p or 400p, but also 240p, resized to 480p, or more specifically 640 by 480, another very common resolution in DOS gaming, or any other number of resolutions that Dosbox is capable of running. And since everything is now running at 70 Hz, this will help reduce the stutter that a 60 Hz display often suffers from, because it no longer has to drop 1 out of every 7 frames now that we're running the display at the same frame frequency as old 90s DOS-based gaming PCs did. Now, the frame rate isn't going to be perfect in every game. It depends on the game. But that's really more of a Dosbox problem. That's not really an issue with your display or the way your display is configured. How are you doing? Are you managing to keep up? I could drastically simplify this tutorial, but I think going deeper into not just the how, but also the why of these specific steps that we're performing here. And hopefully, if you ever run into a problem, you'll possess the knowledge that may help you figure out a solution to that problem because of the understanding of how and why this stuff is the way that it is, rather than just passively following steps that seem random or pointless. At this point, we can now add all the other more common resolutions, stuff like 800 by 600, 1024 by 768, and so on, along with their max refresh rate that this specific monitor can handle. However, there's a lot more resolutions you can add. For instance, even though this monitor cannot support more than 70 Hz at 1280 by 960, it can do 72 Hz at 1200 by 900, and 72 is absolutely perfect for watching movies. I didn't think movies would look smoother on a CRT, and yet they really do. Even if they run at 24 frames a second. I mean, sure, if you had friends over, we would still use something bigger rather than try to huddle around a small CRT. But if you're one of those lucky ones that can get a very large desktop CRT, 1280 by 960 or 1024 is not the limit. There are some models out there that can go over 1440p. I mean, they are rare, but the still somewhat common 19-inch CRTs with a 1600 by 1200 max resolution is probably the closest 4:3 approximation to 1920 by 1080 in terms of total pixels on the screen. So I don't think games on this old tech are going to look worse when compared to a modern display. I would like to point out that if you want better black levels without sacrificing the brightness of the image, then you'll need to increase your monitor's contrast setting while lowering the brightness setting until the black pixels that appear dark gray turns into actual black. And then, once again, head into your GPU control panel and go to the color settings and increase the gamma until you can barely see the dark grays in the reference image. Older games and older versions of Windows generally didn't look too dark back in the day, but it is a bit of an issue today since modern Windows and modern drivers are more balanced for modern displays than they are for old CRTs. By raising the gamma in Windows whilst lowering your monitor's brightness, it will help maintain the deep blacks whilst not having it be too difficult to see darker shades of color in games. And while we're at it, since we're still in the control panel, especially for you Nvidia users, go over to adjust desktop size and position, go to the scaling tab, and under select scaling mode, select aspect ratio, and under perform scaling on, select display instead of GPU. This will help your monitor to, as often as possible, display the visuals at their desired resolution rather than having the GPU scale it in the software mode, which will result in a softer, more blurry look, which we really don't want. So this was a pretty long video. I hope that this tutorial was clear and concise, easy to understand, and I hope that you'll be able to get your CRTs to run as well as humanly possible. Until next time.